Welcome to Storytelling and Beyond, a place where emotions take flight and stories touch the soul. If you love heartfelt journeys of resilience, sacrifice, and hope, don't forget to subscribe and join our growing family of listeners. Today's story will stir something deep within you. Let's begin. The rising sun cast a golden veil across the fields of dry, broken soil. The ground had once yielded wheat that danced in the breeze like gold under heaven, but now it lay barren, cracked, tired, and silent. Eli Carson walked the familiar path from his porch to the edge of the small, forgotten airstrip that ran like a scar across his land. With every step, his worn boots kicked up dust that clung to his jeans and the memory of better days. He was 73, tall and slightly hunched, with weathered hands that bore the story of half a century spent coaxing life from earth. The old hangar loomed ahead, rust creeping up its sides like vines of decay, but Eli saw it differently. To him, it was still alive. It was where his son first learned to dream of flying. It was where the community once gathered for summer picnics and war veterans touched down on special holidays. And it was where, even now, he came every single morning to sweep the cracked runway, trim the wild grass at its edges, and clear any debris the wind had left behind. No planes had landed here in years. But that didn't matter to Eli. He carried an old rake and a hand broom slung over his shoulder. A small canister of fuel bounced gently in his grip, ready to be poured into the backup generator that powered the runway lights. He passed the worn-out sign that still read Carson Field, painted decades ago by his late wife, June. The letters were fading, but like her memory, still visible if you looked hard enough. Eli paused midway down the airstrip and looked out into the open sky. It was quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. A breeze rustled through the nearby cottonwoods, but otherwise, the world felt paused. He sighed deeply, eyes misty, and knelt down to remove a branch that had blown onto the centerline. He winced slightly, his knees didn't like the work anymore, but he kept at it. Clearing. Maintaining. Hoping. A couple of cars passed on the county road in the distance. One slowed, and he could almost hear the driver mutter, "There's that old man again. Still pretending someone's gonna land here." He didn't mind. People had been saying that for years. Some even laughed, calling it Eli's ghost runway. He smiled faintly at the thought. They didn't know what he knew. They didn't know the promise he had made. His son, Michael, had enlisted right out of high school. He'd learned to fly right here on this very strip. Before deployment, he made Eli promise, "Keep the runway clear, Dad. I might need it someday." Eli had kept his word. Even when the news of his son's death arrived like a thunderclap on a clear day, he never stopped. June passed not long after, and with her went the laughter in the house. The only thing that remained constant, solid, meaningful was the promise. And today, like every other day, Eli swept the edges of the runway, straightened the old signal cones, and checked the fuel level in the generator. His fingers trembled, not from weakness but from emotion. Every time he struck a match to light the tiny fuel line, he felt like he was keeping a piece of his boy alive. The sun was higher now. The light glinted off the hangar windows. Eli leaned on the rake, his breath calm, his heart quiet. He looked up again at the sky and whispered the same words he said every morning. "I'm still here, son." He turned and made his way back to the hangar, unaware that tonight, everything would change. The wind was picking up, rolling across the open land like the whispers of something unseen. The old barn stood tall beside the runway, its red paint faded to a dusty pink and its roof patched with tin sheets Eli had nailed in place years ago. It was his shelter when the world outside felt too wide, too empty. And tonight, as the sun began to slide behind the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the field, Eli walked inside, cradling a rusted photo album under his arm. He placed it gently on the old workbench that still smelled faintly of engine oil and hay. With fingers calloused from decades of labor, he turned the brittle pages one by one. The photographs weren't just images to him, they were anchors to a time when the airstrip was alive. There was a picture of him and June leaning against the biplane they restored together in their 30s. Her smile, warm and sure, seemed to lift off the page. In another photo, townspeople gathered during the summer fair, children racing between planes, veterans tipping their hats, and pilots swapping stories over lemonade and cornbread. Then came the pictures of Michael. His boy, his pride. Michael as a young teen, sitting in the cockpit of a small trainer aircraft, wide-eyed and fearless. Michael in uniform, crisp and proud, just before shipping out. Eli's hand paused on that one. The corners of the photograph had curled over time, but the face, the light in his eyes, that hadn't faded. He remembered the night before his son left. They had stood out on the runway together, watching stars blink into life overhead. Michael had turned to him and said, "If something ever happens, promise me you'll keep this place running." "I don't know why, but I've always felt it's gonna matter one day." Eli had laughed softly, brushing off the weight of the words, but Michael had repeated them, slower, more serious. "Promise me, Dad." And Eli did. He had no idea then that he was sealing a lifelong mission with those words. He closed the album gently and sat in the old rocking chair that creaked with every breath of wind through the barn slats. Outside, the light faded from gold to gray. The airstrip lay quiet, the shadows of trees stretching across the runway like reaching hands. The hum of a distant tractor faded into silence. All he could hear now was the rustle of dry leaves and the distant chirp of a night bird settling into the dusk. A cold draft slipped through the barn's gaps, but Eli didn't move. He stared straight ahead, heart heavy with memory. This land, this airstrip, it was more than property. It was legacy. It was grief. It was love. A knock echoed softly against the barn's outer wall, probably just the wind, he thought. He stood slowly, joints aching from the long day's work, and pulled the wool collar of his coat tighter around his neck. With one last look at the photo album, he walked to the door. Outside, the night had fully arrived, stars scattering across the sky like diamonds spilled on velvet. Eli stepped out and looked toward the runway. Something stirred in him then, something he hadn't felt in a long time. An instinct. A pull. He didn't know it yet, but across miles of sky, something was coming. Something large. Something broken. Something in desperate need of what only his airstrip could offer. The wind had grown harsher as the night deepened, its howl seeping through the cracks in the barn, rattling the old wood as if the earth itself was trying to speak. Eli stood in the doorway, gazing out over the stretch of runway that had once been his pride, now little more than a forgotten relic of time. The lights flickered dimly, powered by the small generator he had patched together. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He had made it enough, just like he made everything enough, his farm, his home, his son's dreams. The small amount of land Eli had left was crisscrossed with old fences that needed mending, gates that wouldn't quite shut, and fields that would never again hold crops. He wasn't going to lie to himself, he knew he was fighting a losing battle. The bank had made it clear. The foreclosure papers were in his hand, and the last of his savings had vanished into the cracks of failing machinery and unpredictable weather. The creditors had all but given up, but Eli had not. He wouldn't give up. Not on the land. Not on the promise he made. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. It was the kind of knock that didn't belong to nature. It was slow, hesitant, deliberate. Eli's heart quickened, and he pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders. For a moment, he wondered if he was imagining it, but there it was again, a knock, coming from the far side of the hangar, the direction no one had come from in years. He walked cautiously towards the sound, each step an echo in the dark barn. His boots scuffed against the wooden floor, the air thick with the scent of old hay and rusted metal. It was strange, almost unsettling, to be this deep into the barn in the dead of night, with nothing but his memories and the bitter wind outside. Eli reached the back of the barn, and there it was. A wooden door, long neglected and half hidden behind stacks of crates. It hadn't been opened in years, but the sound seemed to be coming from there. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the door handle, pausing for just a second as an uneasy feeling washed over him. Was it another reminder of his failing farm, or had something finally come to collect on the debts that had been haunting him for months? With a deep breath, Eli turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing only darkness. But as Eli stepped inside, he saw something that shouldn't have been there, something large, looming, casting a shadow against the barn's inner walls. A pair of blinking lights suddenly flickered on, their brightness almost blinding. A C-17 aircraft, its massive body filling the space, had somehow descended from the heavens. The engines sputtered, low, deafening, and one of the wings drooped awkwardly. The air was thick with the hum of something struggling, something on the edge of failure. The military markings were still visible, though partially obscured by grime and smoke. Eli's heart raced, his body frozen in disbelief. The barn seemed to vibrate with the power of the aircraft, its engines roaring in the distance, and yet it was clear, the airstrip, the one he had kept so meticulously, despite everything, was needed again. The light from the C-17 illuminated the inside of the barn, revealing a crew in full military uniform rushing to secure the plane. They worked with urgency, their movements swift and practiced. But Eli couldn't move, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. "Sir, you've got to get the runway cleared," one of the men shouted as he ran past, his voice barely audible over the deafening noise. "We can't risk moving without clearance." The noise from the C-17's engines echoed like thunder across the field, shaking the ground beneath Eli's feet. He stood frozen for a moment longer, staring at the behemoth of metal that had just landed on his airstrip, the airstrip he had cared for, maintained, and dreamed of being useful again. Now, standing in the midst of a real emergency, Eli's mind raced to process what was happening. As the deafening hum of the plane's engines slowly faded, the reality began to set in. Eli's old airstrip, which had fallen into disuse, was suddenly in the spotlight. It had been decades since the last real plane had touched down here, and now it was a landing site for a military aircraft. His hands, shaking from the overwhelming sight, fumbled to grab the flashlight he always carried. He had never imagined he'd be using it in such a way, helping with a military plane on his land, with soldiers running past him and shouting orders. "Get the lights on! We need full illumination," someone yelled from the plane. The crew was moving quickly, their voices sharp and full of purpose, but Eli stood for a moment, as if rooted to the spot, taking in the scene before him. The C-17 aircraft, normally reserved for large military missions, had somehow managed to land, its landing gear scraping the rough, outdated strip with a screeching sound that made Eli wince. There was something majestic yet terrifying about it, this aircraft, massive and powerful, barely holding it together on his small patch of land. Eli stumbled forward, his boots slipping in the mud. The wind cut through his jacket, and for a moment, he thought he might be dreaming. But no, this was real. The military men were already moving, setting up perimeters, securing the area. Eli's heart thudded in his chest as he snapped into action. He rushed over to the generator and flicked the switch, flooding the airstrip with bright, flickering light. The flashlights of the soldiers moved across the runway like fireflies, illuminating the dark spaces as more soldiers began to unload supplies. Eli could see the faces of the crew, some calm, some anxious, and there was a tension in the air, an urgency that sent a shiver down his spine. A man in a tactical vest, who seemed to be in charge, approached him. His face was grim, his eyes scanning the scene with intense focus. "You're Eli Carson?" he asked, his voice cutting through the noise of the activity. Eli nodded, still trying to shake off the shock of the situation. "I'm the one who's been maintaining this strip." The man's eyes softened just a little. "We're in a tight spot, sir. We need to get supplies offloaded, and we can't risk getting caught on the wrong side of this storm. You've done good work here." Eli didn't know how to respond. This wasn't about the work anymore, this wasn't about his promise to Michael. But deep down, he realized that his years of maintaining this strip weren't a futile effort after all. They mattered. This landing, this mission. Everything was connected to something bigger than him. The man continued, "We'll need your help to get the supplies to the trucks, sir. It's all hands on deck." Without another word, Eli stepped forward, nodding. There was no hesitation now. His body was no longer aching from the weight of his age or the years of hard labor. This was a purpose he understood. As the soldiers began to unload crates and medical supplies, Eli joined them, his movements surprisingly swift for a man of his years. He worked alongside the crew, never asking questions, just focusing on the task at hand. The urgency in the air was palpable, but there was something in Eli's chest, a strange peace, that told him, against all odds, he was right where he was supposed to be. The C-17 crew worked in sync with military precision, and Eli, though older and worn, kept pace. Every movement, every glance, every quiet exchange with the soldiers confirmed what he had known deep down. The runway, though forgotten by so many, had not been in vain. Tonight, it was alive. It was needed. And as Eli helped the soldiers, guiding them through the dim lights of the airstrip, something deep inside him stirred. The memories of his son, the promise he made years ago, were no longer distant echoes. They were real. And this airstrip, his land, was a testament to that promise. The wind howled again, but Eli didn't hear it. He didn't feel the cold anymore. There was only the task before him, the life-saving work that had come to him in the most unlikely way. And somewhere, deep inside, Eli smiled faintly. Maybe, just maybe, he had been right all along. As the night wore on, the pace never slowed. The hum of activity on the runway filled the air, and Eli's hands, though old and worn, continued to work without rest. The military crew had set up camp, unloading what seemed like endless supplies. Their voices, sharp and commanding, blended with the sounds of boots hitting the ground, the thrum of engines running, and the occasional crackle of a radio. Eli didn't stop. He worked with a quiet resolve, not thinking of the years behind him, but of the task in front of him. He was part of something bigger now, part of a moment that transcended the quiet isolation of his life. In the distance, the C-17 aircraft stood silently in the darkness, its wings outstretched like a giant sleeping bird. The engine's low hum filled the empty spaces, a constant reminder of the urgency that had brought this plane to his forgotten airstrip. Eli looked up at it now, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the runway lights. A strange peace settled over him. The work had always been about survival, about keeping his son's dream alive. But now, in the midst of chaos, he realized that it had always been about more than just survival. It was about helping others when they needed it most. As the hours passed, Eli and the crew continued to unload the last of the cargo. The storm that had been threatening in the distance had finally arrived, its winds howling with the fury of nature's power. The rain came in sheets, drenching the airstrip, but they pressed on. Eli felt the cold, the wetness soaking through his clothes, but he didn't care. He had made a promise, and tonight, that promise was being fulfilled in a way he had never imagined. The crew finished their work, and the man in charge, the one who had spoken to Eli earlier, came over to him once again. His face was weary but grateful. "You did good work tonight, Mr. Carson." "I don't know how we could have made it without you," the man said, his voice low but sincere. Eli simply nodded, his eyes tired but full of quiet pride. "Just doing my part," Eli replied, his voice raspy from the long hours of exertion. The military crew began to pack up, securing their equipment and preparing to leave. The C-17's engines roared to life, the sound vibrating through the ground, and slowly, the aircraft began to move. Eli stood there, watching as the massive plane turned, its massive body gathering speed on the very runway he had maintained for so many years. For the first time in a long time, he felt a surge of something, satisfaction, perhaps, or even hope. The plane lifted off the ground, soaring into the stormy night sky, and Eli stood alone on the runway, the echoes of the engines fading into the distance. He had kept his promise. His son's dream, and his own legacy, had been preserved, and it had mattered. He had played a part in something far bigger than he could have imagined. As the plane disappeared into the night, Eli stood there for a long time, gazing into the storm. There was no grand celebration. No cheering. No applause. Just the quiet satisfaction of a man who had honored his word. The lights from the airstrip flickered as the last of the crew's vehicles drove off into the night, leaving Eli alone with his thoughts, the rain still falling around him. But as he turned to head back to the barn, a soft smile crept across his face. He had been right all along. The land, the promise, the memory, everything had led him to this moment. And in that quiet moment, standing under the open sky, Eli Carson felt the weight of the years, the burden of loss, and the joy of fulfillment all come together. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story, be sure to subscribe to Storytelling and Beyond for more emotional and inspiring tales. Your support means the world to us, and we'd love for you to join our community of listeners. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story.